speaker tonight is Milan Rai, who's, among many, many other things, co-editor of Peace News with Emily Johns. And for those of you who don't get it, you should. And it's New Look Peace News. It's blooming wonderful. But he's also author of four crucial books on the peace movement, and the founder of Voices in the Wilderness UK, which is famous in my book for its work on the sanctions in Iraq for 5 years, from 1998 to 2003. And in fact, it has the signal honour of being one of only 2 people arrested for sanctions breaking during that time. A badge to wear with pride. Another badge of pride, though, is that when Peace News was celebrating its 75th birthday last year, Milan co-organised a media conference in London. He was going to call it the Radical Media Conference. He couldn't, because there's already an organisation called Radical Media, which is an advertising agency, which slapped him with a cease and desist order for calling it the Radical Media Conference, as a result of which it had to be changed to the Rebellious Media Conference. So my vote's with Rebellious Media. You just keep right on rebelling and leave the radical people to make ads for Vodafone and Chevrolet and General Motors. Okay. So we're very fortunate to have him, and crucially to have him talking about Iran. The threatening noises that have been coming out of Israel and the USA in particular over the last few months have raised the stakes on Iran. There's a wonderful cartoon in The Economist just before Christmas called the Persian Perpetual Motion Machine. I don't know if you saw it. And it shows cross Iran, saber rattling in the USA, threatening noises from Israel, scaremongering in the Western media, cross Iranian clerical leaders, and so on, in a ghastly, vicious circle. It's just about sums it up. So we're clearly at a crossroads here. Iran, war or peace? Milan's going to tell us.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you very much for inviting me to Bath. I'm wearing 2 hats here tonight. One of them is as part of a small peace group called Justice Not Vengeance. Emily Johns, who's my partner, who's also a member of the group, went to Iran on a peace delegation back in 2007, and this is a photograph that she took there. She's an artist. She's also the co-editor of Peace News. She's an artist, and she made she met a lot of people. It was a Fellowship for Reconciliation delegation, and she met a lot of people over there as part of the delegation, and also made art coming out of that. And that exhibition was toured around someplace, and the catalogue for the exhibition, which has got some remarks by me about the nuclear crisis. There's some the last copies actually of the catalogue over here, if people are interested. One of the things that I hadn't known before she started investigating Iran from her perspective was that the word paradise comes from Persian, from Farsi, and the word that is used in English, and it refers to, in Farsi, gardens of paradise. And when she went, she was very surprised by how many gardens she came across, and she met someone while she was on a speaking tour afterwards in Wales who said that he'd been to Iran a lot, and that his sense was that when you crossed over into Iran from Turkey, you could tell as you came over the mountain, because the smell of roses came up, and that's how you could tell. So, and she found that herself. I thought I'd just show one of the pictures she made about Iran. This was actually before she went. This was to celebrate the survival of this woman after the Bam earthquake, which people remember. She survived several days underground without any food or water, and she kept herself together by reciting poetry, and she memorized a lot of poetry. And Emily has a connection with poetry, and so I'll have a couple of other pictures, I think, in the exhibition. Another person in our group is Maya Evans, and this is a picture of her in Afghanistan at the beginning of the year. She's just come back, and as many of you will know, yesterday she got out of prison for refusing to pay a fine in relation to anti-war protest outside Northwood against the war in Afghanistan back in 2009. I always like to read from today's paper during a talk, but I thought I'd also refer to something that was in the paper a week ago. In the Daily Telegraph last Thursday, there's a little note saying, "Soldier too important to the army to go to jail." A soldier who assaulted two men outside a pub escaped prison because he is too important to the army. He is too important as an army gunner to be jailed. So he got sentenced to some unpaid work and costs. Maya wasn't too important, and she did have to serve 7 days of a 13-day sentence. So the small piece of it was called Justice Not Vengeance, and a lot of the stuff that we've produced about Iran and Afghanistan is on this website. I'm also involved, as has been said, as Peace University. We don't have a giant big talk like this, but there is a summer camp happening in July. You're very welcome to come, where Iran will be discussed along with a lot of other things. The theme of the camp this year is non-violent revolution. Anyway, so that's a little bit of introduction about where I'm coming from. As has already been said, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States have been meeting, and it's the tensions between the US and Israel, the tensions between both them and Iran, I kind of felt like they're coming to a head, and there's been a lot of concern expressed in all quarters about what might happen militarily. My own feeling is that I don't think that there's going to be any military action against Iran this year. If people want to explore more about that, we can. But unfortunately, in terms of the question of war or peace, I think we are on the road to some major confrontation. I don't think this year, but something is coming. So, just to say a little bit about Iran, I think there's three basic facts about Iran which I'd like to get over, if nothing else. Firstly, as I'm sure everyone here knows, Iran is not an Arab country. It is ethnically and linguistically, culturally distinct from its Arab neighbours, and it's a predominantly Persian country speaking Farsi. Secondly, as I'm sure a lot of people will know, Iran is predominantly a Shia Muslim country, and its neighbours are, almost all of its neighbours are predominantly Sunni Muslim countries. So it's not an Arab country, it's a Shia Muslim country, and there's one third basic fact about Iran which I'd like to try to get over. I'm noticing here on my screen that the next few slides, some of them are blank, so I don't know whether they're actually going to come through. So this is the current president of Iran, Mohammad Ahmadinejad, and in the West, he is portrayed in the media as the leader of Iran. But the third fact about Iran that I'd like to get over to you, basic fact about it, is that the president of Iran is in a very different constitutional position to the president of the United States or France or whatever. The president of Iran does have a whole lot of responsibilities and power, but now we're going to see whether this shows up. Okay. But there's someone else who heads the constitutional framework, and the clue is in the title, the supreme leader. is the supreme leader of Iran. So this is not Ayatollah Khomeini, this is Ayatollah Khamenei, and he is in charge. This is a rather complicated diagram. You don't need to grasp the full details of it, but basically you can see that the supreme leader is in charge of the military and the paramilitary forces, and the president has some input into defence and foreign policy. So, I've got another diagram. So the supreme leader is in charge of foreign policy, in charge of military policy, and the supreme leader is at the apex of power, and there's another level of power. These are the sort of directly elected parts of this particular part of the Constitution. Obviously, there is filtering in that you can only stand for the Parliament or for President if you've been approved by the establishment. So there's a filtering system which cuts out a lot of people and a lot of political opinion. But these are directly elected parts of the system. But the Supreme Leader is at the apex of it. So one of the reasons why President Ahmadinejad is sort of put forward, by Western journalists and Western newspapers who know perfectly well what the constitutional framework of Iran is, and that he is not, like President Obama, is that he does have some very strange religious beliefs. He does say a lot of wild things which cause embarrassment in Iran about his attitude towards a lot of things, and it's because he is a wild character that he is put forward as the figurehead of Iran. But in fact, the supreme leader is quite a different character, and it holds the reins of power. I have to say this is very funny, because the advantage of this was supposed to be that you would see the slide and I would see what was coming up, but all the coming up slides are completely blank, so the advantage is lost entirely. Okay, so I'm going to try to place this in the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty very briefly. So the NPT started off in 1968. Again, very complicated diagrams from some Russians. So there were 5 declared nuclear weapon states at that time when the treaty was signed, and there are various other states who are nuclear, have nuclear weapons: Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea, a whole bunch of countries who could become nuclear within a decade, or also if they wanted to. Now, I'll just say the top line of this diagram is: a nuclear state is defined as one that detonated a nuclear device prior to the 1st of January 1967. So the NPT was designed to kind of put a boundary around the people who were already declared nuclear weapon states at that point, and to try to prevent proliferation. Well, obviously it failed, as a whole bunch of other countries joined in. So what's in the NPT? Very briefly, the nuclear weapon states can't transfer nuclear weapons or control over nuclear weapons to other countries. Countries which are signed up to the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states aren't allowed to receive any nuclear weapons or control over nuclear weapons, or to try to get help in manufacturing them. Article 3, non-nuclear weapon states have to accept inspection and monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and this is a monitoring camera that they're setting up, I think, in Belarus. Article 4 is that, nevertheless, the non-nuclear weapon states are allowed to have nuclear power, and nothing in this treaty shall be interpreted as affecting the inalienable right of all the parties to this treaty to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, without discrimination. Article 5 is that countries are allowed to transfer peaceful nuclear technology to each other. And Article 6 This is a picture from Afghanistan, actually. I was trying to find a picture that would sum up the disarmament aspect. In Afghanistan, one of the things that they've got a lot of, this is a picture by Guy Swarman, who just went to Afghanistan and did a talk to Peace News when he got back, and we have an exhibition of Guy's pictures which is touring around the country. I was looking at these things around, these panels around the room. This is a picture that Guy took in Afghanistan. One of the things that Afghanistan has got a lot of is metal, leftover Soviet tanks, all sorts of stuff. And this is melted down Soviet tanks being turned into covers for sewers and so on. This was one of the positive pictures that Guy brought back. So Article 6 says, I think I've got the text here. So they're all supposed to, all the declared nuclear states are supposed to engage in negotiations in good faith to bring an end to the nuclear arms race at an early date and nuclear disarmament. So stop the nuclear arms race and then nuclear disarmament and then go on to general and complete disarmament. So that's what they're supposed to have been doing since 1968, is engaging in those negotiations. So Article 7, I mean it goes on, there are lots more articles but they're pretty technical. Article 7, nothing in this treaty affects the right of any group of states to conclude regional treaties in order to assure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories. So there are a bunch of nuclear weapons-free zones at the moment. You can't see all of them because of some defect of the setup. The UK is signed up to all of those nuclear weapons-free zones, apart from Southeast Asia covered by the Treaty of Bangkok. The United States has ratified the treaty relating to Latin America, but hasn't ratified any other treaty. The African nuclear weapons-free zone, the US entered a reservation saying that they said we respect that it's a nuclear weapons-free zone, but we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons if there's a chemical or biological weapon used in that area. So they haven't ratified it anyway. None of the declared nuclear weapon states have ratified the Treaty of Bangkok or entered in, said that they're going to abide by it because they all want to get their nuclear weapons, submarines and ships through these waters. So none of them have signed up to that. So there's a bunch of nuclear weapons-free zones. And in a way, the question of war and peace, Iran, war and peace, to a considerable degree turns on whether there could be a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, which is something that's been talked about for a long time. Obviously, in the region, Israel has nuclear weapons. They've got maybe 200, maybe 400 nuclear weapons. It's a more diverse and in some ways more sophisticated arsenal than Britain's got, and they've got more warheads, it appears. So, from the Israeli point of view, a nuclear weapons-free zone in the area would leave them with a security problem in that a lot of these other countries definitely have had chemical weapons capabilities and may have biological weapons capabilities. I mean, Iraq was the most experienced country in the world in the use of chemical weapons because of its massive use of them during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So, really, from the Israeli point of view, if there's going to be a nuclear weapons-free zone, it ought to be a weapons of mass destruction-free zone. And in fact, Egypt tabled such a proposal back in, I think, 1990 as part of the UN disarmament process. And it's supposed to have been under consideration since then. So, and when they talk about a Middle East, generally what people are talking about is from Libya to Iran and from Syria to Yemen, that sort of territory. There are various other proposals to bring in Turkey and other countries, which sort of would make sense because Turkey's US ally, has got US bases in it, and has had US nuclear weapons in it, and definitely in the past may have them passing through. We don't know. So that's sort of like the ideal possibility. And while we're mentioning US allies and so on, from the Iranian point of view, the US has got aircraft carriers, submarines, and reserves the right to deploy nuclear weapons. It's got a whole load of seaborne assets in the Persian Gulf. It's got bases all along the Persian Gulf. These are all US allies. Iraq is occupied by the US. Just over here is Afghanistan, which is occupied by the US. Again, cut off by some defects of the projector. Is Pakistan over here is US ally. Obviously, they've fought relationship, but they have had US bases there. Turkey, US bases, US allies. So from the Iranian point of view, they're kind of surrounded by US allies, US bases, and potentially US nuclear weapons, which the US has said it reserves the right to deploy, and they have a nuclear-armed enemy state over there. So, looking at it from the Iranian point of view, there is a geostrategic logic. If you're totally surrounded by a nuclear-powered superpower which is hostile to you, there is a geostrategic argument that Iran should equip itself also with nuclear weapons. That is a lot of people look at that situation and they see that. The Iranian government itself says it is not going to have nuclear weapons. It regards it as religiously unlawful and so on. They made lots of declarations to that effect, and no one has yet demonstrated that Iran has decided at a policy level to acquire a nuclear weapon. And President Obama's been saying that recently. So there are these tensions around Iran's nuclear arsenal, or not Iran's nuclear arsenal, the Iran's nuclear power program, which a bunch of people suspect could be leading towards a nuclear weapon, though that hasn't been proved yet. Well, the hostility around Iran's nuclear power program and the suspicions around it are, well, I think you have to see it in the context of other states. So Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It allows inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, though there are questions. They've had friction with the IAEA over various things, and people will have heard about the recent request of the IAEA to inspect a particular military facility, and Iran refusing to do that, and now it looks like they might allow it. So there has been friction, but they are inspecting the declared nuclear facilities of Iran, the uranium enrichment and so on. So Iran is a member of the NPT, allows the IAEA to inspect, and no one has proven that they have a nuclear weapon, and Iran is not. No one has accused Iran of passing nuclear weapons technology to anyone else. So Israel, has not been a member of the NPT, has never allowed IAEA inspections of its nuclear facilities, definitely has nuclear weapons, and we know about that through a whole bunch of sources, including Mordecai Benoni, who was locked up in solitary for years after he was a nuclear technician at Dimona, the nuclear weapons development center in Israel, and he came out and he told the world about Israel's nuclear weapons. So we know Israel's got nuclear weapons, and Israel also helped to pass nuclear weapons technology to South Africa when they were helping South Africa to develop a nuclear weapon. Pakistan is not a member of the NPT, doesn't allow the IAEA inspections. The AQ Khan network, based in Pakistan, using Pakistani government resources, was a sort of nuclear weapons technology export business, which was involved with pretty much everybody: North Korea, Libya, Iran. We know that they were exporting nuclear weapons technology left, right, and centre. And we know they definitely have nuclear weapons. They've declared that they're a nuclear weapons state, outside of reaching the norms about non-proliferation and so on. The list goes on. So North Korea withdrew from the NPT throughout the IAEA inspectors. Says it's developed nuclear weapons. We don't know that it's passed on nuclear weapons technology to anyone else, but it's in reach of. It's actually withdrawn from the NPT. India has developed its own nuclear weapons. Doesn't allow IAEA. Is outside the NPT. So these four countries have all. Three of them have declared that they've got nuclear weapons, including North Korea. One of them we know has got nuclear weapons. Several of them have been involved, two of them have been involved in quite significant proliferation activities, spreading nuclear weapons technology to other countries. They're in very tense parts of the world where hostilities could blow up. In none of the Iran has been treated completely differently to all of those. So the nearest, in terms of the amount of crisis that there is around its nuclear program, is North Korea. But as we've been hearing recently, their talks are on again with North Korea, and North Korea has done a deal with the US, and the US is going to resume food aid to North Korea in return for North Korea making some concessions on its nuclear program. Incidentally, the US had always said that food aid was humanitarian. It was not a political weapon. Well, turns out it was a political weapon because they're resuming it after North Korea makes some concessions. One of the really interesting differences between the North Korean situation and Iran is that let's see whether this slide has come through. Okay, right. In 2003, I don't know why I illustrated this with a newspaper story, but in 2003, for those with brilliant eyesight, you'll read the story. In 2003, Iran sent a secret message via the Swiss to the United States saying, we're prepared to do a deal with you. You've got concerns about some of the stuff we're doing, and we have some concerns about what you're doing. And we're prepared to offer what's called a grand bargain. And this terminology is continued to be referred to. So you're concerned about our support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. You're concerned about our support for Hamas in Palestine. You're concerned about our nuclear program. You're concerned about our influence on the Arab-Israeli crisis. Well, we're prepared to stop material support for Hezbollah. We're prepared to stop material support for Hamas. We're prepared to do some deal with you about the nuclear program. And we're prepared to publicly support the Saudi Arabian two-state proposals in relation to Arab-Israeli crisis. In return, we want a bunch of things from you. We want normalization of relationships, and they wanted various things from the US. The key thing they wanted from the US was a security guarantee, which is to say, a guarantee from the US that the US would not attack Iran with nuclear weapons or with conventional weapons. That was their key goal, to get a promise from the US that they would not just go and attack them. And the US just chucked this offer straight in the bin. Now, in the case of North Korea, the US has given North Korea a security guarantee. Now, there's all sorts of problems. The whole process is limping along, and it's very troubling and so on. But in the case of North Korea, they were prepared to seriously negotiate and give North Korea some of the stuff that they really wanted. There are all sorts of problems with the process, and I think most of the responsibility for its unsatisfactory state actually lies with the US in not following through with various things. But that's secondary. The main thing I want to point out is that there's a complete disparity in treatment of Iran and North Korea, where with North Korea they keep, the US keeps coming back to the table. They keep being willing to do things. They've been willing to offer a security guarantee. With Iran, they just haven't. I don't know why I put this in. Okay, maybe it's because, yeah. So it's, why is there such a crisis with Iran? It can't be Iran's nuclear program, because as a proliferator, Iran is not even in the game, whereas Israel, Pakistan, North Korea, India, they have all proliferated. And what's happening with those countries? Okay, North Korea, there have been some sanctions, and in some ways, not delivering the food aid was a form of, actually starvation as a sanction of North Korea. But India's been getting a nuclear deal with the US. Pakistan gets aid. There's various problems in the relationship, but they're to do with US military strikes and the war in Afghanistan. They're not to do with the nuclear program. Israel obviously is getting a ton of political, military, economic, financial support from the US. So those proliferators are being tolerated and in some cases massively supported. So it's not to do with proliferation. And it can't be that the US is so upset about Iran's human rights record, which is not good at all. Because if you look at Iran and Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Muslim country, Iran is a Shia Muslim country, Iran's Persian and Saudi Arabia is Arab, but apart from that, it's one is a pretty fundamentalist society state, the other is a pretty fundamentalist society state. People quite rightly get upset about the public hangings and the brutal legal punishments in Iran. They're chopping people's hands off and doing very similar things in Saudi Arabia. So, in terms of the level of human rights, there's a kind of right-wing group called Freedom House in the US, and they rate every country in the world according to civil and political liberties and so on. And Saudi Arabia is just below Iran. It is below Iran in terms of those. If you look at the treatment of women, it's the treatment of women's rights in Iran are incomparably better than in Saudi Arabia. In terms of democracy, Iran, for all the problems with the democratic system and the controls that there are, it has a better democratic system than pretty much every country in the region, apart from Israel. In Saudi Arabia, the big democratic innovation that they're experimenting with right now is local councils, how much how much direct election they will allow for some, little local councils. So it can't be because Iran is so undemocratic. It can't be because Iran's got such a terrible human rights record, because in the region it doesn't stand out as just massively different. It can't be any of those things that get talked about. I think that if people want to press Iran on human rights, I think that's absolutely right. But to single out Iran as the problem in the region, it just doesn't make sense. If you apply the same standards to all the countries. So, something has got to be to do with oil, and quite how that comes in, I think, is the amount we can tease out. But this is a picture that Emily did, symbolising or marking the discovery of oil in Iran in 1908, and apparently it was found very near a place which is known as the Mosque of Solomon, or something like that, something to do with Solomon. So she put a flying carpet to represent the way that the oil kind of tore holes in the fabric of Iranian society. So that was in 1908. This is in the 1950s. At the head of the Persian Gulf, and there's a big oil works in Iran. Anyone want to have a stab at what company was running this huge complex? Yep, it was Anglo-Iranian Oil, which was the forerunner to BP. So Anglo-Iranian weren't just an oil company in Iran, and they weren't just a company. They were in many ways, the biggest economic force in the country because they controlled the major economic activity of Iran. I'm wondering where I'm going with this. Okay. So they controlled the lifeblood of the country, and especially after the Second World War, Iranians started noticing what was happening with other oil producers and saying, we want a similar deal. We see that US oil companies have got a 50-50 deal with Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. We want a 50-50 deal on the revenues. Anglo-Iranians said, they were absolutely scandalized. They said, no way. And so the Iranians said, well, okay, you're paying us this tiny royalty. Anglo-Iranian at that point were paying more in taxes to the government in London than they were paying in royalties to the government in Tehran. So the Iranians said, well, okay, you're paying us this tiny royalty. Can you at least show us your books so we can check that you're paying us this measly percentage, that you're actually paying us the right amount, even according to the formula which you're refusing to give up on? Anglo-Iranians said, no way, we're not going to do that. So what happened was that there was a huge movement inside Iran, and it was led by Mohammad Mossadegh. This, I think, is now the most up-to-date way of spelling his name. I've seen, I think, 7 ways of spelling his name in English, in transliteration. And he was elected Prime Minister of Iran, and he oversaw the nationalization of Anglo-Iranians' operations in Iran. Well, the British government and Anglo-Iranian completely blew their tops at this nationalisation. Now, meanwhile, back in the UK, the Labour government's nationalising coal, and they're nationalising left, right, and centre. But when the Iranians start doing it, that's completely unacceptable. They took the Iranians to the World Court. They lost. They got all the oil companies in the world to boycott Iranian oil, which basically brought the economy to its knees. They had a military blockade of Iran to stop it exporting oil, and the MI6 started trying to plot the overthrow of the Prime Minister. However, as soon as they started doing this, Mossadegh threw the British embassy out of the country, which meant that terminated the whole operation because the military attaché and everybody had been shut down. So MI6 went over to the CIA and said, okay, we're having some problems here with this guy, we need to overthrow him, can you come and help us? And so the CIA started their operation, on which they spent a phenomenal amount of money. And in Iran, it was run by the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, President, a man who delighted in the name Kermit Roosevelt. And so he ran this operation. He bought politicians, he bought mullahs, he bought cartoonists, he bought journalists, he bought street gangs to create disturbances and so on. And he had a big push, and it flopped. And so the order went out from the CIA saying, forget it, just come home. He ignored the order. He went out and spent more money. He got all these people really whipped up, and he got one street gang to go through Tehran shouting, yay for communism and Mossadegh, who didn't have anything to do with communism. Yay for communism and Mossadegh, smashing the place up. And he got another street gang to run after them, beating them up, to make it seem like law and order had just totally broken down. And he created an enormous amount of turmoil. And he got the military finally to grab Mossadegh, and he was overthrown. And the Shah returned. He'd run away as the first coup attempt had failed. He'd run away, and he came back, and it was a military dictatorship with the Shah at its head. And so that, in 1953, was the end of Iranian democracy until 1979. And so when now Westerners say there needs to be more democracy in Iran, from an Iranian point of view, they're very, very aware of this history. They're very aware of the US role, they're very aware of the British role. Britain is seen as somehow more sinister and manipulative than the US. So the British are seen like behind everything. So they're very aware of what happened. Incidentally, if you want to see the CIA's own internal history, if you Google Donald Wilber, you'll find this document, which is like their after-action report about how they did it, about exactly stage by stage how the CIA carried out its first coup. This is a tool for extracting fingernails discovered in a torture chamber run by Savak, which was the CIA of Iran under the Shah. And Iran under the Shah was one of the worst places in the world for human rights. And that was, a direct consequence of the coup and what the US and Britain brought about. Incidentally, Britain didn't do very well out of that whole coup, because whereas BP had pretty much had the whole country sewn up, as a result of the CIA coup, BP's percentage ownership of oil concessions in Iran went really down, and the US grabbed the lion's share, which London complained about a lot, but post-war realities of power, it was part of a number of things that showed how Britain had lost its status and the US was taking over. So in the end there was an eruption, and there was, I'm not sure you could call it a non-violent revolution. I think you could say it was an unarmed revolution in Iran. Maybe 10% of the population came out to demonstrate against the Shah's regime at the end of 1978. And once again, the Shah ran away, and the system collapsed, and there was this revolutionary upsurge. And it was made of all sorts of divergent political streams, but the stream that was best organised, best known, and most focused was Ayatollah Khomeini's clerical organisation, and they gradually seized the reins of power. But they were not the sole organisers of the revolution by any means. So 1979, there's a huge eruption, and the regime collapsed. And since then, Iran has been a thorn in the side of the US and the West generally by being an independent force in the Middle East. So just something about what has most recently been worrying Western commentators about Iran's role is that Iraq has been, for a long time now, a majority Shia country. So most of the people, so Iraq is an Arab country, but most of the people in Iraq are Shia Muslims, like 65% or so. Now, as long as Saddam Hussein was in charge, that didn't matter, because his narrow Sunni elite clamped down on the country, and the Shia were very severely repressed. So people could get locked up for being a bit too diligent in going to the mosque. And, it was a very harsh system. But since the fall of Saddam Hussein, and since the People Power movement in Iraq, which forced the US and Britain to allow a directly elected parliament, which they were very reluctant to allow, and they were gradually forced by massive mobilization in Iraq, the Shia majority has had a commensurate say in Iraqi politics, obviously within the framework of US occupation. Now, it so happens, I think the next slide, it so happens, these are oil fields. Obviously the size of the blob doesn't denote how much oil there is, it's loosely related to how much oil there is. But you can see that this northeast corner of Saudi Arabia has got a lot of oil, and it's also the Shia area of Saudi Arabia. So a lot of Western commentators and a lot of Sunni rulers in the region fear what they call the Shia Crescent. If Iran has very good relations with a lot of the political parties in Iraq, many of whom sheltered in Iran during Saddam Hussein's time because they couldn't survive in their own country. So they have good relations with a lot of political parties in Iraq. And what Saudi Arabia is terrified of is the Shias in the Northeast Quarter who are working in this oil-rich area, them starting to stand up for themselves, demanding equal rights, maybe autonomy, maybe having some relationship with Iran or Iraq or whatever. So the Shia minority is very harshly treated in Saudi Arabia, forbidden to carry out public religious ceremonies and so on. It's very, very tightly controlled. That's also one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia was so quick to blast into Bahrain when the democracy movement started there, because Bahrain is also a majority Shia country and with a Sunni elite in charge of it, and they didn't want the Shias of Saudi Arabia getting any ideas of being part of the Arab Spring or whatever. So the fear is that Iran's influence may be expanding now that Iraq has got this kind of semi-democracy and so on. And that is seen as a bad thing. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia is spending millions, I don't know, maybe hundreds of millions on spreading its influence all around the world with this very harsh and reactionary brand of Sunni Islam. But that's not seen as a problem. And that's not seen as a problem because the religious fundamentalists who are in charge of Saudi Arabia are basically see themselves as loyal servants playing their role within a US-dominated world economy. So Saudi Arabia describes itself as a swing producer of oil to even out, when there's fluctuations in supply of oil from other people, partly to maintain the oil price, but to reassure the West that the Western economies and the Western-dominated economic system is going to continue to run smoothly. So, as someone once said, they're sort of Harvard Business School graduates who wear unusual clothing. I mean, they're very much loyal parts of the system, whereas the clerical religious fundamentalist regime in Iran, they don't see themselves as servants of anybody. They want to be an independent power in the region and in the world, and that is really the threat. I think that the major threat that Iran poses to the US is that there is growing interest in cooperation between Iran, which has got energy resources, and China, which has got growing industrial capacity, and Russia, which has got a bit of both. And if those three countries form some greater economic union, and that will draw in other countries, and India has been part of some of these discussions and so on. I mean, there are various fora which are being used as exploring these increasing links. One of them is called the Shanghai Cooperation Council, and there are other ones. And if those countries were to form greater economic cooperation between them, then they become a very powerful unit that doesn't have to take orders from anybody. They can ignore instructions or pressure or whatever from other countries because they've got the energy, they've got the industrial capacity, they've got the military capacity to be an independent force within world affairs. So I think that is the great risk for the United States, and that's what they want to break up. Now at the moment, because Iran's under sanctions, because Iran is internationally isolated over its nuclear program and so on, that has put a halt on a lot of this stuff. So Iran's got observer status in the Shanghai Cooperation Council, and the connections are not tightening up in the way that people thought a few years ago that they might. Another effect of the sanctions which are being tightened right now is that it cuts off these relationships. That India is cutting its trade with Iran because it's becoming more difficult. Because what the US is doing right now is it's going around the countries of the world and the financial institutions of the world and saying, if you trade, if you have any financial dealings with the central bank of Iran, we will sanction you. And so it's basically a sort of international bullying, really. And through such means, they are significantly reducing people's trade with Iran. Really what they're doing is they're carrying out a blockade by other means. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, a blockade is an act of war. They wouldn't have the ability to get that passed by the UN Security Council. They don't have any way of doing this through the forums of international law. They're just doing it unilaterally. And what they have done is they have effectively declared economic war on Iran. Iran's currency, the rial, has lost maybe 50% of its value in the last few months. Inflation's running at 20%. There's already significant unemployment in Iran. Ordinary folks like us are really hurting in Iran because of all of that. And partly it's to do with the economy of Iran, but a lot of it is to do with the intensification of sanctions. So, I've been talking for a very long time at this point. Maybe I'll say a little bit. Maybe I'll jump to kind of the end, which is I think that when that 2003 proposal was made by Iran to the United States about a grand bargain to try and resolve all these issues, there was someone working in the State Department, who actually in the National Security Council, called Flint Leverett. Flint spelled with a Y, and he and his wife are now, I think, probably the best analysts on what's going on in relationship to the US and Iran. And at the time, he described it as a serious pre-negotiation proposal. And what their analysis is of the situation between the US and Iran is that the US has not been serious about negotiating a way out of the nuclear crisis, has not been serious about a diplomatic solution, and the US and Iran are on a collision course. And that's because, in their view, his wife also used to be on the National Security Council as a Middle East analyst as well, an intelligence analyst. And their analysis is that the US, all of the evidence indicates that the US is not prepared to allow Iran to be an independent force in the Middle East. And they will not be content until Iran has become integrated into the US-dominated system. So I think that we are likely to have increasing confrontation. I don't think it's going to happen this year because it would be a crazy move for the US to accept or instigate in the run-up to the presidential election, which is in November. So I don't think it's going to happen this year, but I think next year things are likely to heat up quite a lot. Now, how can we get past all of this? What is the way out? And Iran has got uranium mines, and so it has the capability to have a complete nuclear fuel cycle within their own country. So they can mine it, they can mill it, and then they can enrich it at their own enrichment facilities like Natanz and near Qom, and then they can have put the nuclear fuel into their own nuclear reactors. So that is a matter of national pride in Iran, this nuclear program. And when Emily went around, everyone she met defended Iran's right to nuclear power. And when you look at the opinion polls and you look at political currents within Iran, it's pretty much a national consensus. It's a matter of pride and dignity. So they want to have a nuclear fuel cycle on their own territory. The rest of the world wants to stop them diverting any of this into a weapons program. And there is actually a way of pretty much meeting those two opposing interests. And I wonder if it's going to come up next. So I'm going to skip through. You're skipping the short version of gas centrifuge uranium enrichment. If someone's dying to see that, well, can do. This is two former diplomats. Thomas Pickering, former U.S. diplomat. He was high up in the Reagan administration. He's no lefty by any means. John Thompson used to be a British diplomat, ambassador, and so on. And what they've both been saying, and they both have background communications with the Iranian leadership, what they've been saying is there is a way of meeting both of these concerns by what's called a consortium proposal. So you have an international consortium, countries from around the world all own the uranium enrichment facilities. There are foreigners working at every level. So this is actually at Natanz. These are centrifuges in which they're enriching uranium. So there are foreigners working at every level, like in the accounts department, on this level, at all levels. And there's also the IAEA doing inspections and monitoring. And that way, the outside world will have the highest, the best humanly possible guarantee that this system is not being used to produce weapons-grade uranium for a weapons program. And incidentally, to power one of these cascades, you need sort of the energy for a small city or something. So it's not very easy to hide this kind of thing. It's not 100% guaranteed, but the idea is you have a consortium, it's owned by countries from around the world, it's staffed by countries from around the world, and that way you've got eyes on the ground, you've got hands on the machinery. And if Iran ever decided to go for a nuclear weapon, they'd have to chuck all these people out and dissolve the consortium or nationalise it, and that's a huge trigger for the rest of the world to say that we now know they have suspicious intentions. Why are they doing this? So that's what Thomas Pickering and John Thompson have been proposing. Every so often you'll see an article appear in the New York Times or the Independent, whatever, but really it's pretty much ignored by the political media elite. There's no real discussion of it. And one of the bizarre things about it, this is Ahmadinejad addressing the General Assembly in 2005. And if you go back and read his speech, you'll find that in front of the General Assembly, he said that Iran was prepared to accept a consortium owning its enrichment facilities. And as you will have heard recently, there are all sorts of splits in the Iranian political elite, and there's been a lot of tension over the last year between Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, the supreme leader, and so the fact that he said it at that point, if only he had said it, then that would indicate one strand of opinion. But in fact, a lot of Iranian officials and diplomats have indicated this at different times over the last, since 2005 and earlier. So Iran doesn't want to appear too keen, because that sort of puts them, that's kind of a humiliating position. But they've definitely signalled a green light to explore this option. And who knows, it may be the big breakthrough that they're going to announce at the resumed talks. They say they have some proposals afoot in the talks which are about to resume. I don't know. What I think, one thing that I would say with some confidence about the consortium proposal is that I believe that if the majority of people in the US and the UK knew about the consortium proposal, I believe the majority of people would say, let's do this. This is a no-brainer. It costs virtually nothing to do. It means that we've got a level of intrusive inspection that no one has been dreaming of with Iran's program. There's no need to rush to bomb all this stuff if we can have people on the ground. I'm absolutely sure that most people would say that. Of course, it's still up for negotiation. When Ahmadinejad said in principle we're prepared to do it, he didn't endorse the Thompson-Pickering exact proposal, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to negotiate about it. But I'm convinced that if most people knew about this, they would put pressure on the British government, the US government, to explore this, which they're refusing to do. So I think Iran war or peace, there is a peaceful way out of this. It might not lead to success, but there is a very feasible, kind of politically realistic proposal which meets both sides' core objectives that is not being explored, and the obstacle is not the madness of Ahmadinejad. The obstacle is the unwillingness of Western leaders to resolve this without the humiliation of Iran. And I have to say, I think that's what they're seeking. They're not prepared to have a way out of this that doesn't involve the humiliation of Iran. Okay, I'm going to say one last thing to try to back up that assertion. A while ago, back in 2009-10, there were talks between Iran and the same powers are going to sit down with them again now, and they weren't getting anywhere on the central questions, because the Western powers were saying you have to stop enrichment now while we negotiate, and Iran said, well, we did that before and it didn't get anywhere. We spent years suspending our uranium enrichment and you never made any serious progress on that, so there's no incentive to do that. So they stopped talking about that and they started talking about confidence building measures. So what the Western power said was, okay, you're building up this huge stockpile of low enriched uranium through the stuff in Natanz, all this enrichment. We're scared of that because that stockpile could be converted to highly enriched uranium and to nuclear weapons grade uranium. So we don't want you to hang on to that. What we want you to do is we want you to trade the low enriched uranium that you've got now for some fuel rods, the equivalent amount of fuel rods, which can't be turned into weapons grade uranium. And Iran said, okay, we can talk about that, except it has to happen on our territory. You bring in the fuel rods and then we'll let you take away the low enriched uranium, because we don't trust you. And if you look at their relationship with even their allies like Russia, Russia's been building this nuclear power plant at Bushehr for years, and I think they were supposed to go operational 10 years ago, and it's just about to go operational now. So even with their friends, they have so many problems, and that has been, the delays have come because of Western pressure on Russia to slow down building this nuclear power plant. So they don't trust the outside world. So they said, no, we're not, we can only do it on our territory. And the Western said, we don't trust you. It has to be outside. You have to export your low enriched uranium stockpile, and then you will get the fuel rods. It broke down at that point. So I said I wanted to read from. There was a whole bunch of stuff. There was loads of stuff in today's paper, but so that is referred to actually. The FT has got the best coverage on Iran, always has, for years and years. And today they have a whole page article about not almost all, about Iran. And so you'll see in their timeline, so it says here, 2009, in October, world powers begin talks with Iran and try to agree a deal that would see Tehran swapping 1,200 kg of its low enriched uranium for fuel rods that could be used for civil nuclear purposes, but not a bomb. Despite attempts by Brazil and Turkey to revive a deal, no agreement is reached and talks fizzle out in January 2011. Well, that's a little bit disingenuous, and when you read the main article, it explains a bit more about it. I think it's in this article. They talk a bit more about what happened with Brazil and Turkey. So it's quite a long article. I'm not finding it, but they do explain that what happened with Turkey and Brazil was that Turkey and Brazil actually reached an agreement with Iran. And if you go back to, I think it was May 2010 or something like that, Turkey and Brazil had seen the breakdown in this, this impasse about on our territory, off our territory, They'd gone to Washington, they'd said, we think we can negotiate with Iran and deliver this confidence-building measure which will help move things along. Washington had said, okay, you can go try that. They went away, they talked to Iran, and lo and behold, Iran said, okay, we trust you, we will export our low-enriched uranium to Turkish soil, and then, we will expect everyone to honour what they've said before, and we'll get the fuel rods, and then, Turkey will give them the low-enriched uranium. And if they don't do a deal, we'll expect Turkey to give us back our low-enriched uranium because we trust them. So Brazil and Turkey said, we've done it, we've moved things along, we've delivered what the US was asking for. They're going to get this stuff off their territory, which is the dangerous stuff. All of the Western powers turned around and said, no. So the thing which they'd been asking for months earlier now was no good. And the reason it was no good, and as far as I can see, was because Iran managed to hang on to a shred of dignity. It was no longer humiliating enough. They'd done a deal with some southern powers. They had this deal with Turkey where Turkey was going to be a guarantor for the Western powers, and it was no longer acceptable. So they just brushed it aside. And so Turkey and Brazil were really very embarrassed because they'd gone to Washington in advance. They hadn't just gone off and done this. They'd gone and cleared it with Washington in advance. But now, when they went back and they actually delivered what they'd been asked to deliver, it was just thrown back in their face. And so that was a major setback for them developing their role on the world stage. And also a major setback for Iran. It's like just confirmation of what Iran thought about the West. That the West won't take yes for an answer, basically, if the yes has some dignity and self-respect for Iran. Okay, well, I've got a big... I'm not sure I should leave it on a picture of my Mozambique dinner tag. Maybe we'll go back to the roses.
Yes, everything's coming up there.
It's a long way to the roses. Oh, this is like a revision. Okay.
Right, and you should have some cooling water.
Thank you. I've
brilliant stuff. Is it all right if we pile questions
Please
on
do.
now?
I'm sorry. I'm looking at the clock.
No, apologise.
Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. I mean, most of us have had enormous wells of ignorance about this, and you have helped to top up with knowledge and insights and some amazing paradoxes and some appalling double standards. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. But I know you will have questions as well following that. So,
a very brief comment, which is that the consortium sounds so unspeakably cheeky and humiliating that I'm just astonished that Iran would consider that. I mean, how patronising, but they really, I mean, obviously they signalled some interest. So I'm amazed, precisely because of all the double standards and the encircledness of Iran. So that's encouraging, but also bloody annoying.
I think what is a matter of national pride in Iran is that they've managed to develop this technology themselves, and that they have the capacity to do this. So I think having a nuclear fuel cycle under their own control, on their own soil, and that is the product of their own technical development, that is the key thing for them. And having foreign ownership and so on is definitely intrusive, but the core of it remains, which is it's a nuclear fuel cycle. It's our own uranium, it's our own technology, that technical achievement needs to be there, and I think that's what, as far as I can make out, most Iranians feel very proud that they managed to do something, which other countries thought they weren't capable of and so on. Yes, Iran has got a lot of oil and it has got a lot of gas. Now, there are quite a few briefings on the JNB website about Iran, and one of them is called Iran's Oil Crisis. And I'm not going to find it right now, but Iran has a lot of oil and it has a lot of gas, but because of the breakdown of relations with the international or not so good relationship with the international oil companies and so on, because of their sanctions that are being placed on it, there's been a decay in their capability for extracting oil and gas, and they're not developing. They don't have the refinery capacity which they ought to. So I think they import various refined products because they don't have the capacity to generate it internally. All of that is background to the fact that Iran's got a young population, it's got a growing population, and it has rising expectations in terms of its living standards. So the domestic demand for energy is rocketing. So what that means is that Iran can produce a certain amount of energy, and the proportion of it which is consumed domestically is growing. So back in 2007, there was a US geographer called Roger Stern who wrote a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on the US, in which he said the worst case scenario was that by 2015 Iran would no longer be able to export oil because it was using it up domestically. So I don't think that the biggest driver of the nuclear program is to do with energy diversification, but there is a logic to it. It's not completely irrational for an oil-producing state to try to diversify its energy production within its own borders. They also talk a bit about hydro and solar and stuff. I'm not sure they're making any serious investment in those areas, but if they can shift a considerable amount of their domestic energy demand to electricity generated through nuclear or these other means, then it means that they continue to preserve their lifeblood, which is the hard currency earnings from exporting oil and gas. And over 60% of government revenue is directly from that, so which supports a lot of the economy. So there is a rationale. I'm not saying that that is the reason why they've been so committed to it, but there is a rationale for it. Now, back in the 1970s, the US was very supportive of nuclear power in Iran and did a lot to promote relationships between universities in the US and technical expertise in Iran and so on. And they were promoting it heavily. And they saw a rationale for it then. But the same people in the Bush administration were phenomenally against it years later. People who've been junior back in the Nixon era and were senior in the Bush era, back then they were supporting exporting this technology to Iran. In the 2000s they turned against it.
Going back to the consortium idea, which seems such an obvious one, I highly agree with the first comment that was made that this would be so humiliating for Iran. And despite what we say, I'm not convinced when it came to it to accept that. But to broaden it a little bit, would it not be a logical response from Iran to say, well, why shouldn't every nuclear state accept an international consortium? If they will, then we will.
Yeah.
And let's have people go into these
Absolutely.
while what's going on.
And the previous head of the IAEA, Mohammed El-Baradei, was very much interested in precisely that kind of initiative because, as everyone in this room knows, a nuclear power program can lay the basis for a military program given political will and so on. So it makes sense, if you want to stop those developments, to have an internationalization of those capabilities. And that's something the IAEA did talk about, and it's a perfectly sensible proposal.
Why go even further? I mean, the military establishments as well. Why do you have to have a secrecy?
Well, it is generally believed, not just in Israel, but I think sort of amongst Western commentators and the Western political and military elite, that Iran is trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. So that's the first part of the picture. The second part of the picture is that there is a perception, I think again it's probably generally held in the media and political circles, that Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So when you put those two things together, that's why Iran's nuclear program is described as an existential threat to Israel. On the first point, there isn't evidence. This is what the CIA has said, this is what Obama said. There is no evidence that Iran has decided to pursue a nuclear weapons program. And on the second, that a lot of that comes out of one particular speech by Ahmadinejad, where he talks about Israel being removed from the pages of history, which you can translate as removed from the face of the earth. Now, what I think if you go back and read the speech, what he says is the Soviet Union disappeared from the pages of history, apartheid South Africa disappeared from the pages of history, and Israel, it would be good if Israel also disappeared from the pages of history. Now, everyone knows that not everyone in South Africa was incinerated, and not everyone in the Soviet Union was incinerated. Those political systems disappeared. So if you actually read what he said, what he wasn't talking about driving all the Jews into the sea. What he was talking about was ending that state system, that structure. Now, it's quite likely that he would like to see Israel, destroyed or whatever. But A, he isn't in charge of Iranian foreign policy, and B, even he wasn't setting it as a policy objective for the government of Iran. And if you look at what the Supreme Leader has said on these matters, the government of Iran, the Supreme Leader, have expressed support for the two-state solution, which is why in 2003 they were willing to say, we'll publicly endorse this as part of this grand bargain. But it's not, they have expressed a lot of hostility to Israel. They have supported Hezbollah and Hamas, though apparently things have cooled with Hamas recently, probably a lot to do with the fact that Hamas has withdrawn its support for the Syrian regime, which Iran continues to support. It is definitely a difficult relationship, but no one has demonstrated that Iran has set itself the goal of destroying and annihilating Israel. And I think all of the indications are that Iran is willing to follow the lead of Hamas, which has talked about a long-term truce based on a two-state solution, if that is genuinely achieved. So, but if you are convinced that Iran has started acquiring a nuclear weapon, And if you interpret what has been said by Ahmadinejad as the policy objective of Iran and put it as they want to smash Israel, then you very quickly see why Iran is an existential threat. Now, if you read the commentators and the analysts, they are more candid about what the threat is. Because if you read the commentators, what they say is, and sometimes even the generals, what they say is, if Iran got a nuclear weapon, we would have to think more carefully about taking action against Lebanon and so on. Because if we invade Lebanon and we run into Hezbollah and we start smashing out Hezbollah and Iran extends its protection, then we have to think about the possibility that what we're doing could trigger a nuclear conflict. So what the rational core of this fear is that Israeli military and political leaders are worried about their freedom of intervention and military action in the region being constricted by their anxieties about the Iranian bomb. So the fear is the rational core of it is not so much that Iran is going to drop the bomb on Tel Aviv and try to wipe them all out. The rational core of it is that Israel will not be able to continue acting as it has been acting up until now, of doing whatever it liked, whenever it liked, and not having to think about the consequences because they had the US backing them up. So I think that is the rational core of it, and that's also, to a certain extent, the rational core of the US concern, which has also been throwing its weight around the Middle East for a long time. And if Iran had a nuclear weapon, they would definitely have to tread more lightly and think more carefully about what they were doing. So I think at the level of the general public, I'm sure it's a completely sincere concern that Iran wants to wipe us out. But I don't think the evidence base is there. I think in elite circles that perception is stoked, but I think from a quite different set of concerns.
Just to agree with you, I think North Korea has mostly created social effects in the past against South Korea, but now America is still doing it, and they know that they've got nuclear weapons. So, the two positions they described.
Absolutely.
Just to reflect on our own experiences there's a lot of talk about weapons of mass destruction, just before invasion of Iraq and another Iraq office. So I'm a bit sceptical when people start talking about Iran being the biggest peace invasion. It sounds like what I thought before, is used to justify policy that makes a lot of nuclear and get those peace.
Okay.
Just going back to the point about what Ahmadinejad may or may not have said just once, 7 years ago possibly. I was on the Conservative Home website this morning. Sorry. I can explain, but there's a very interesting article on there by the only Conservative MP who voted against the Iraq War. His name has just gone out of my head, sorry. And he goes to that particular point and takes it apart in terms of the poor translation of what was actually said and crucially the context which you've also made clear about talking about other regimes that have come and gone. So if you ever need chapter and verse on whether this person said this thing once, look on the Conservative Home website. It is remarkable because the main tenor of the article was not about that. He just thought, let's get this point straight once and for all. He did not say it, and what he did say was something that was pretty unexceptional in geopolitics. Then went on to say that what you need is negotiation, which is exactly your point. And that makes me comment that people like Thomas Pickering and John Thompson, and I think our man at the IAEA was retired, they all say that negotiation is possible. These are deeply conservative people, totally respectable, and they think it's possible. Why do the nuclear bureaucrats, if you like, why are they not listened to? They're the people who know more about this than anyone else. And you've got jumped up politicians who have apparently no knowledge of history or language, and they just make it up. Makes me very cross. Sorry, I've just abused the property of the chair. Any other questions?
Yes, it seems to me that for the peace movement, that there are two tasks. One is to try and do whatever we can to make sure that there isn't a war on Iraq, and the other is actually to look at the whole non-proliferation treaty issue and the double standards and the cheek of people who think that it's terribly good for them to have nuclear weapons and it gives them all the power and influence that they want, because other people shouldn't join in that game, and that we're not doing what we signed up for. And these are kind of maybe they're complementary goods, but they seem to be, in terms of energy, a bit competing, and I think they're both equally important, because it's out of the whole continuing proliferation and weddedness to military solutions to everything that we're in this fit, and yet there is this specific urgent thing. So do you have any advice for campaigners as to how to focus either or both of those things, and so that we can have a really effective national and international campaign on this?
Well, I think there's a lot of educational stuff to do to counter a lot of the propaganda that's around, because there's a lot of fear of Iran, and there's this probably a lot to do with Ahmadinejad, this picture of Iran as an irrational actor, as a crazy country, and I think there are lots of specific things. I think this stuff about the consortium, I think, is really critical in terms of public opinion and in terms of showing that there's a way out. In terms of proliferation, I think that the most relevant thing is about the weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And, Britain and the US in April 1991 with the UN Security Council Resolution 687, which was about the war in Iraq, they said, after this is all done and dusted, we're going to work on a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. So we actually, that was part of how we justified the war, was it will lead to this benefit that we're going to make a big push for that. So, we have a responsibility to follow through on that. I think that it's often hard to see how people in Britain can play a constructive role in relation to the Middle East, because there are so many complicated issues, and it is so far away, and we have so little leverage over a lot of the people who are involved in it. But I think that I genuinely think that linking those ideas about non-proliferation in the Middle East to our own military activities is a key thing. And if we really want there to be a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, the first step we could take as Britain is say we will not deploy, or we will never use our weapons in that area, we'll never deploy them in that area, and so on. So there's something that we can say to our government, like we can make a contribution to that. And of course, the government, instead of engaging in good faith negotiations to disarm, instead is preparing the way ahead for the next generation of Britain's nuclear weaponry. And I'm amazed at how much financial pressure there is on that decision, and how that decision is being pushed back. Because I sat in, there's a group of people who are very concerned about the Trident replacement program who get together every month or so. And I sat in on one of their meetings quite a while ago, and they were talking about the initial gate decision, and which is this crucial decision to go ahead with the program and so on, with the replacement program. And they were deciding, it's scheduled for next month, might happen next month or the next month or a month after that. And one person said, we've been talking to people in Whitehall, we might get put off for quite a long time. And the rest of us sitting in the room, I think everyone else had the same reaction as me, which was incredibly sceptical. It was like, they're really committed to this. But they did put it off for a very long time, and there isn't a lot of pressure on that. And so I honestly think that helping to put pressure on that decision and linking it to Britain's own nuclear weapons and the weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, I think that is a useful contribution, because Western countries have been going into the Middle East and throwing their weight around, and often throwing their nuclear weight around, and people in the region know about that, even if we don't know so much about it. And if I can give one really weird example of that, in the run-up to the 1991 war on Iraq, the US and Britain were both concerned about Iraq's chemical warfare capability, because they were the most experienced country in the world at chemical warfare because of using it during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. And so they wanted to dissuade Iraq from using its chemical weapons on Western forces. And so by various means they conveyed a threat to Iraq that if they did use chemical weapons, Britain, yes, would use nuclear weapons. And there's lots of documentation to show that threat was made at that time. But the weirdest bit of that documentation is, as everyone here will know, the question of the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons went up to the World Court. And all of the World Court judges wrote a separate opinion about their take on the question. And the US judge, Judge Schwabel, wrote his own opinion, in which he said nuclear weapons are lawful, and they should be lawful, because US nuclear threats against Iraq stopped them using chemical weapons in 1991, and that is a good thing, and therefore working backwards from the good that was achieved there, nuclear weapons should be lawful, and the threat of them should be lawful because it can achieve positive results. People in the region know that the US and Britain have been making nuclear threats for decades now, and I think that if the British government was to say that we're removing any caveats from our declarations of non-use, because the British government has made promises which are called negative security assurances not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, but it's full of loopholes about if that country, that non-nuclear weapon state, is associated with a nuclear weapon state, and there are all sorts of loopholes in it. Anyway, so I think there's a bunch of things that we can definitely call for, and I think one thing we can do is also we can go to Iran as well, and me and Emily are thinking of going there on a peace delegation in November, and I think that kind of person-to-person contact is valuable and is useful.
I think we should give you a break. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Right, we've finished. Can I just run through a couple of quick dates and housekeeping notices. One is it's annual subscription time to support the coalition. £10 for a waged person, £5 for an unwaged. So do think of paying your sub. That's how we keep going. The next coalition meeting is a fortnight tonight, Wednesday, 21st of March, here at 8 o'clock. And among other things that we'll be discussing that evening, there is the appalling news that the council is allowing the assembly rooms to be used for a drone fair in But here in Bath, 25th to 28th of June, a trade exhibition for drones. Beggars belief. It sounds so innocent as well, as somebody observed earlier. It sounds a bit like dodging or something. So that is something we're going to need to mobilise around. And the final date is, of course, Saturday, 11:30 to 12:30. As always, vigil outside Bath Abbey. We've been doing it for since most of us can remember.
And the focus on Iran.
And the current focus is don't attack Iran. We've got lots of material and petitions and wonderful placards, and we made a colourful show outside our major tourist attraction in the centre of the city. Don't forget, 11:30 every Saturday, rain or shine. Thank you, Milan, for coming and giving us such a wonderful insight into a subject about which you know an enormous amount and which we clearly know far too little, but our ignorance has been illuminated tonight, and that there is absolutely no substitute for hearing somebody like you. You read the stuff, but you transform it by your passion and your energy and your knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.